I'm sure most people want to go and see Gabriel's talk in the Avenue, but thank you for taking this your time to come to this one. It's an interesting talk, I think, for some people. But I mean, the title is Refining Petroleum Through Net Zero Ambitions, a look at a just transition with spotlight on the fuel transport sector. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about the net zero, the goal with refineries, but actually just looking at the oil and gas and refining industry in Africa in general, and a bunch of other stuff. So my name's Shawn Duthie. I'm with Control Risks. Full disclosure, I know absolutely nothing about refining petroleum. Not a thing. I deal more with intelligence gathering, political risk, security assessments, things like that. But we do a lot of work with oil and gas companies, with finance companies dealing with refineries and oil and gas. But we have two very intelligent individuals who know a lot about refining. First, Anibor Kraha. He's the Executive Secretary of the African Refiners and Distributors Association. And he's the former CEO of Refineries and Petrochemical Directorate of the NNPC. So come on up, Anibor. And second, we have Philippe Cohen, who is the newest member, advisory board member for the Executive African Energy Chamber, and has a load of experience dealing in finance for oil and gas, forestry, a whole bunch of other sectors. So it's going to be a very interesting talk. Because it's such an intimate, we're not, with the nice thing, well, not the nice thing about COVID, but it's not a ballroom of 300 people. So by all means, if you have a question or a comment, ideally a brief comment at any time, raise your hand, a mic will come to you. You don't need to wait till the end, so just, feel like you are part of the discussion as well. Okay, so we're going to start, Anibor is going to do a presentation on net zeros and refinery, and then we're going to start the conversation, which I hope you will all join in and be a part of. So, Anibor, I'm going to pass the floor to you.
Thank you. I think I'll go there.
Yeah, it is on the side there.
You want to watch?
It's a small room.
Yeah.
Oh, it's on now. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon. We're feeling very special because we're competing with His Excellency Obiang. So for you to be here, we're very happy you're here with us and not at the main venue. The presentation I have is adapted from one I did for IPECA early on. It came right after the IEA released the Net Zero Emissions by 2050 report. And this was basically, a discussion was held about what it meant for different parts of the world. So I did part of this presentation as challenges for Africa for net zero. There was a speaker there for India. There was somebody who spoke about the Middle East. So when we got this topic about refining petroleum through net zero ambitions, I thought it would kind of fit in place. So this is what I'm going to talk about. For those who don't know the organization I work for, I have a brief introduction on ARA. It used to be ARA, it's now ARDA. Talk a bit about the case for action, which is tied into net zero emissions. Some considerations for an African downstream energy transition plan. What I think I'm going to end with is what we're calling a tale of 3 decades, the need for a finance plan for energy transition, and I'll end with some key takeaways. So quickly, what's ARA or ARDA? The African Refiners Association, or ARA, was founded in 2006, so this is our 15th year. Its name was changed to ARDA, which is the African Refiners and Distributors Association, in 2017 to reflect the complete downstream supply chain, which is not just refiners, but marketers, distributors, and regulators. And our role, essentially, is to promote exchange of best practices amongst all our stakeholders, but also to promote investments across the downstream supply chain. I tell folks I'm not a refiner or anything. I'm a businessman in the downstream business, so our role is to ensure we support various stakeholders to put investments in the downstream on the continent. We also promote African energy security. We want to promote maximization of crude oil through our refineries, storage, and then putting refined petroleum products through a storage and distribution network to get to all nooks and crannies of the continent. A little bit about what we did. This year, because of COVID, we launched what we call the 2021 ARDA Virtual Workgroup Workshop Series. I challenge anybody to say that 5 times very quickly. It's be a bit of a challenge. But anyway, we did this in second quarter. We're going to do it in the same time next year. And what we did is we have 7 work groups which touch on key parts of the downstream: LPG, storage and distribution, refining and specs, HSE and quality, human capital, financing, and regulation. And these are the topics we looked at. In April, we had 2, LPG, and the goal of this work group is essentially to promote actionable investments in the LPG sector across Africa. And we looked at how do we build an African LPG market for African LPG? Why should our LPG end up in Europe and not in other parts of Africa? And we looked at how we need to collaborate to do that. Also in April, we looked at how do we build a robust storage and distribution roadmap to ensure we have an excellent supply chain on the continent. We have all these discrete projects going on. We need to have coordination in how we make those investments. May, we had 2, refining and specs. How do we upgrade our refineries to produce cleaner fuels? I'll talk a bit more about that later, because it may interest you to know that we have for gas oil or diesel, we have 11 different specifications across the continent, ranging from 10 ppm to 10,000 ppm. For gasoline, we have 12, ranging from 10 ppm to 2,500 ppm. So how do we upgrade our refineries to produce 10 ppm fuels? HSE and quality, you've heard a lot about ESG. We need to make HSE and quality, which is the cornerstone of ESG, a license to operate in the downstream. Human capital, how do we ensure we get the right people in the right jobs at the right time? We looked at strategic HR, how we align our human capacity development goals with our business plans. Financing, how are we going to pay for all this stuff? And we have various folks. We have a resource mobilization plan for our members, which looks at various forms of financing. I see my friend from Afrexim is here, one of our supporters. We have a few commercial banks, some traders and the like. And the last one is regulation. How do we ensure we have robust regulation across the continent to drive all these plans? We had a big conference, or it was virtual, last month. The theme was developing Africa's downstream energy transition plan, and that kind of feeds into what we're talking about today. We need a roadmap that's uniquely African. It's not a one-size-fits-all thing. This net zero emissions plan by 2050 is a plan, but it's not the plan for Africa, and we need to develop ours. So we use this forum to engage various folks, key stakeholders. We had His Excellency, I see my sister from OPEC is here. We had OPEC Secretary General, the Minister of Energy for Côte d'Ivoire, the CEO of Vitol, Argus, and quite a few other industry stakeholders talk about how we will get this done. So now that I've finished plugging ARDA, let me get into today's topic, refining petroleum in a net zero emissions type of world. First thing we have to do is frame what is actually going on in Africa right now. The IEA Africa Energy Outlook for 2019 was very clear. For Africa, energy demand is going to grow about 45 to 50% between now and 2040. Fossil fuels, when you look at the primary energy mix with this chart on the top left, fossil fuels are actually going to be about 60% of that primary energy mix. Okay? Now, simultaneously, 1 in 2 people born globally between now and 2040 is going to be African. If you look at the chart on the bottom left, you can see that by 2035, we're going to have 30 cities in Africa that are going to have 5 million people or more. So increased energy demand, increased urbanization, and increased urban population will, of course, lead to increased pollution. So if we do not have an orderly transition and get into cleaner, less polluting fuels, transport and cooking fuels, we're going to have a public health nightmare on our hands in Africa. So fundamentally, the case for action is essentially we must meet Africa's growing petroleum products demand with cleaner fuels. And we must focus on that first now, because that is a near-term issue for us, before we start to embark on the global net zero emissions plan. And I'll talk about why that's the case a little bit. Okay. So this is a chart I just pulled from the IEA net zero emissions report. It's the one that came out in May that caused all the uproar. I think there's a part here that says no more oil and gas investments. We've seen what's happening to oil prices because of that, and a variety of things. But let's be clear. If you read the report, and I recommend everyone does, it says, it's one path. It's not the only path, but there's so many things that have to happen for this net zero emissions by 2050 plan to come into fruition, okay? But every part of the world has different socioeconomic circumstances, and those have to be factored in. So you need to have a unique energy transition plan for Africa that recognizes where Africa is, and in terms of even emissions. There's an article by the Energy Hub in Washington, D.C. that talks about reframing climate justice for development. And it basically touches on the fact that if you really look at where development financing is going, it's not actually looking at the needs of the folks that need it the most with the energy poverty. If you look at the cumulative global CO2 emissions from over the last 100 years or more, you will see that the US or North America has contributed 29% of the global emissions. You will see that Europe has contributed 33%. You will see that Asia has contributed 29%. Africa has contributed 2.73%. And if you back out North and South Africa, the rest of Africa, which is Nigeria and 47 other sub-Saharan countries, have only contributed 0.55% of the emissions. So why would they follow a plan like this, which does not recognize their own peculiar circumstances? So let's talk about some considerations. If we are going to develop a plan, what should it look like? First thing, financial. It's going to cost money. If you agree with the first case for action chart I showed, which is population is going to grow, energy demand is going to grow, and a lot of it is going to be fossil fuel driven, where should we spend our money? Should we be focusing on near-term reduction of air pollution via cleaner fuels, or on energy transition via largely expensive and unproven technology? Okay? We believe the limited public funding must be focused on cleaner transport and cooking fuels, and we need separate financing frameworks for that transition, which I'll touch on a little bit. Now let's talk about the technology. Again, the same IEA Net Zero Emissions report, if you read it, it's clear. Majority of the technology for hydrogen is still in prototype or demo stage. 55% of the technology required to deliver on the net zero emissions for carbon capture, utilization, and storage is still in prototype or demo stage. 45% of the technology for biofuels is still in prototype or demo stage. So again, we really cannot afford to start focusing on jumping technology and replacing cleaner cooking and transport fuel alternatives with renewables now. Let's focus on what's important for us now. And over time, when these technologies become more mature, more cost-effective, then we can take them on. Now, besides that, there are some other considerations we must factor in, okay? We must focus on public health right now. We're going to have serious issues. It used to be that you knew someone who probably knew someone that had cancer or other respiratory issues. Now it is much closer to home for everybody. If you personally have not experienced it, someone very close to you has. Our supply chains that we have in Africa today, the tariffs and all of that, are too complex, too inefficient. We cannot actually deliver on any clean fuel, any clean technology mandates, renewable technology mandates right now. So we have to fix that. But there is a silver lining. We have the African Continental Free Trade Act, or ACFA, that's been put into place, and that presents an opportunity for us to galvanize ourselves by the African Union and our regional economic commissions to implement a harmonized energy transition plan that is uniquely African and allows us to meet our near-term and long-term energy transition obligations. So let's talk about what this energy transition should look like. We believe that you need to have 3 different pillars under which you're driving your energy transition. The first one, transport and cooking fuels. You must, I know I sound biased, but you must upgrade your refineries to start producing cleaner, lower sulfur fuels. We have a program we've been working with the African Union Commission where we're trying to get all refineries on the continent to start producing 10 ppm sulfur by 2030. And we have an investment plan that we're putting together. We did a study. It's going to cost about $15.7 billion plus or minus 50%. But we think that we can get this because if you argue that you're taking a refinery, for example, that produces 3,000, 4,000 ppm sulfur gasoline and you're going to 10 ppm, you actually are helping with energy transition to clean energy. We need to have a major push to replace biomass with LPG because it's a cleaner cooking fuel. And we believe near term, that is the best option for Africa to actually reduce its carbon footprint. And lastly, we need storage and distribution infrastructure. We need coordinated harmonized investments in that across the continent. Let's put the right terminals for LPG, the pipelines, the ports, and the like. Now, power, we need to ensure we focus on natural gas and some renewables as cleaner primary energy source alternatives for power generation. Okay, we need to upgrade our power transmission. Let's be honest. There's a lot of power that's been put in place, but it's not even being evacuated to national grids because we don't have transmission in place. And then, please let's be sure that we support all of our domestic and all of our industrial demand before we start talking electric vehicles. I mean, for a lot of folks, we've come to Cape Town. At my first night here, I went to, Potluck Club. And as soon as I got there, power went out. I had to climb 6 stairs. That's the reality. Why would I be thinking of an electric vehicle when I can't even get power for the elevator to take me upstairs to have dinner? So let's have some priorities on that. The last thing, then we can also focus on some energy for transport. Definitely biofuels make sense. You can convert some of the refineries to biorefineries. You can import, you can blend. Ammonia, hydrogen for land and marine operations, definitely. And a big one, jet fuel, sustainable aviation fuel, is definitely going to be there. So we need to ensure that our policies on the government side are focused on these 3 pillars so that we can be successful at what we're trying to do. And what are we ultimately trying to get to? We call it a tale of 3 decades. We need to have a clear finance plan that we agree with all stakeholders so that we do not get punished, and institutions that are supporting our unique African energy transition plan are allowed to do so in a measured way over the next 3 decades. So what should we be looking at? Decade number 1, from now to 2030. Let's upgrade our refineries to produce 10 ppm sulfur fuels. Let's have a big push for LPG for clean cooking. Let's also ensure that we do gas to power as much as we can. And then mature technology like solar, we can adopt that at this point. Decade number 2, 2020 to 2030 to 40, big push in LPG for clean cooking, big push for regional infrastructure, making sure we do gas to power, clean stuff, and then solar again, and wind, normal wind. Offshore wind still has some teething problems. And then by decade number 3, remember I said Africa is only producing 2.73% of the global gas emissions. We don't need the same kind of aggressive acceleration that, North America and the like use. By then, by decade number 3, when the technological innovation is there, this is now more cost effective, then we can adopt the offshore wind, the carbon capture utilization and storage, as well as ammonia and the like. But we need a uniquely African energy transition plan, and we need to ensure that we work with the right stakeholders to get something like this in place, and more importantly, the financiers who are all turning off taps and saying they're going to starve African energy projects need to be to come to the table with us and agree this. And like I said, it's for illustration purposes only, but I think something like this needs to be agreed, and financiers need to be put beside it. And then if Africa as a whole deviates from a plan that's agreed, then we can have a discussion, but not before, because again, we need a uniquely African energy transition plan. So in closing, key takeaways: 1, our energy demand in Africa is growing, but we must meet this with cleaner fuels so we don't have a public health disaster on our hands. 2, there is a proposed net zero emissions plan, but it's a global one, and it's not an Africa one. We need our own unique African energy transition plan that meets our peculiar needs and socioeconomic circumstances. 3, we can't afford to leapfrog cleaner technologies now and go straight to renewables. It's not going to make sense for us at this point. We need to separate implementation strategies for cleaner transport and cooking fuels, lower carbon power generation, and what our renewable energy plan is going to be. And last but not least, I cannot stress this enough, we must have a measured, decade by decade, sustainable finance plan that ensures that we have the funding to meet for the investments that are required to deliver our own unique energy transition plan for Africa. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Edibor. Come take a seat. Nice to see the room is filling up as well. For those who've just arrived, we like to do things a little bit differently. So by all means, if you have a question or a comment at any time, raise your hand. We'll make it a discussion amongst all of us. to start with, let's go right to so what does it mean to be net zero? I mean, in terms of refining and oil, what does it mean to be net zero?
Well, I think essentially there's a Paris Agreement that happened a couple of years ago, and there were some agreements that were made. Some of you may have gone to COP26, and there were agreements that we need to kind of slow down the rate at which the Earth's temperature is rising. I think the idea was to slow it down to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So net zero emissions is a plan that says what are the practical things we need to do to start to get to net zero emissions. All the different industries that are going, what is their emission footprint? Are they energy efficient, and are they cutting down their CO2 emissions to the barest minimum? So that's basically what net zero emissions is. So you'd have heard that every country has nationally determined contributions, NDCs, and every country is supposed to put in place a plan on how they are going to get to net zero emissions. So that's my view on it.
Yeah, well, and Philippe, for you, I mean, you deal a lot in finance, in oil and gas and other sectors. What can investment companies, people who are putting the money in, what can they do to kind of help with this goal, to get to this goal of net zero?
Well, they have to support new and old technologies to reduce this carbon emission situation. I'd like to first thank Anibal, because I learned a couple of things on your presentation. The fact that between, let's say, sub-Saharan Africa and outside of North and South, there's only 0.5%, you said, of emissions in the world is interesting, because I come from North Africa. I was raised in Morocco. I've worked half my life in Africa in different countries. And I don't see why Africa should carry the guilt of the others. I think that's what the situation is. And also, refining is not the worst industry in terms of emissions. Steel, China is much worse. But just to give you an example, I think America's refineries cater for 13% of emissions. And most of that, to about 85% of it, is combustion and cat crackers, which are of hardly any use in sub-Saharan Africa. If you take the northern refineries, which is basically now Libya and Algeria and Egypt and South Africa, because Morocco's refinery closed 6-7 years ago. Yeah. That's where the cat crackers are. They're not anywhere else except in Mr. Dangote's future refinery, which might consume, 4 or 5% of African oil production.
Pardon
roughly.
my ignorance, I am a humanities student. What is a cat cracker?
It's to put it simply, it's the sophisticated piece of equipment that allows you to make high-grade gasoline. And most African refineries in the sub-Saharan region are small, and they just make basic products, so they have to import gasoline, like in Nigeria. And they export fuel oil that is of little use other than to feed some of the power plants.
And in regard to the whole kind of oil and gas kind of stream, you said that refineries aren't the biggest emitters. Like, where would the pollution or the carbon dioxide that comes from refining fit, like, relative to other parts of the oil and gas kind of timeline from ground to into a car?
I think the way to think about it is, so refineries, if you go past any refinery, they have flares, for example. That's emission right there, okay? So that's low-hanging fruit. So for example, right before today, just before I got into here, I just finalized an MOU. Well, they've signed it. I got to sign it. I can't sign because I'm here. But with Vitol, and what we're doing is we're going around all the refineries in Africa to look for projects where we can look for how to eliminate flares and generate carbon credits. Because what's happening now in Europe particularly, for example, a lot of the industries have done as much as they can, but they're still not net zero compliant. They're still emitting, right? So African refineries and other gas projects and the like can actually generate carbon credits that can now be sold to Europe for real money. I think Gabon actually sold its credits to Norway, and it's a viable thing.
So if they don't emit as much carbon as maybe is their level, then they get it back.
When you're burning a flare, you're burning, I mean, you're releasing CO2. That's the easiest way I can explain it. You go past a refinery, and usually it's a thing of joy. Oh, the flare is on, so the refinery is running, right? But the reality is, in the net zero emissions world, you're generating CO2 emissions. So you should actually reduce your flare or eliminate it as much as possible. If you have the upstream, for example, a lot of the platforms have flares. Yeah. So there's actually work going on. There's a company called Capterio that actually has technology that can tell you the intensity and the size of every flare on the continent, in the world. And what they're doing is trying to see whether they can raise the financing to actually go flare by flare and eliminate. So that's something refineries would fall into.
And is there new technology for these refineries to end flaring and to make them cleaner?
I mean, there is technology to do that. But like Philippe said, refineries are not the biggest polluters. You know, cement companies, those are the guys that are really, the heavy industries. Those are the guys that are really, really polluting, you know. So I think that's why I come back to refineries. For me, their role really is, let's eliminate flares. Let's get more energy efficient, okay? So can we use more gas turbines? Can we ensure that there's what they call an energy efficiency index, be on the lowest totem pole on that as possible, so that way you're not emitting as much. But the bigger focus should be on, like you said, China. Yeah. Places like that where they have heavy industries that are actually driving pollution. Like I mentioned, Asia has contributed 33% of the global CO2 emissions, and China is a big part of that.
And within Africa, how many refineries are there? I think you were saying, Philippe, before that if you take up North America and South America.
About 40, I think, now.
There are 36 refineries.
Operating.
Well, operating is a different... But if you're just talking, there are 17 in North Africa, there's 7 in East and Southern Africa, and there are 12 in West and Central Africa. So there are 36. But they're not all operating. So again, if they're not operating, they're not flaring. If they're not flaring, they're not polluting. So
they're at net zero. We've done it.
Well, that's not the kind of net zero we're looking for.
And do you think, considering, and I think a lot of what we've all kind of been talking about is that it's almost unfair how Western countries will say, well, you guys must follow, in Africa, you have to stop doing everything you're doing, and which was obviously going to impact growth. Do you think, the idea of net zero should, in your opinion, do you think should African refineries, which are obviously very small, I imagine, compared to the rest of the world, should they be on the same timeline to be net zero as ones in America or ones in China? Maybe.
Not really. It makes no sense in that respect. I think finding solutions for the various flaring issues, whether it's at the field or at the refinery, is important. I think reconfiguring and upgrading and cleaning refineries, most of the refineries outside of the north and south operate at less than 50%. Some, like Cameroon, have been closed for 2 years after a fire, and no one knows when it's going to be revamped, not even if it's going to be revamped, really. And it was probably one of the largest in the area, in Central Africa. So, no, it shouldn't be at the same speed, and they should have a lot more flexibility. The other thing that is important is the population of Africa is going to double when most of Europe is going to shrink, and Japan and the States, etc. And it's only consuming in its refineries about maybe maximum 20% of the oil it produces. So you also have the factor that instead of producing products, you import products, so transport emissions. And you export the crude to China, India, Europe, more transport emissions.
Has there been a push? I mean, obviously, Dangote's going to, he's got plans to build a refinery in Nigeria. But
Well,
has there been a push?
It's half built,
Okay.
or more, yeah.
Are there plans to increase the kind of beneficiation of oil and gas rather than take it from the ground, send it somewhere else, and then bring it back, like you were just saying? I mean, what's happening on the continent in terms of building more refineries and more cleaner refineries as well?
I'll pass on to my colleague because Nigeria is the key, I think, in this respect.
Well, thank you, Philip. So the
The
first
central
thing,
point.
no, definitely, the biggest thing in refining on the continent in the next couple of years is the Dangote refinery. But I think we should be clear that it's not a silver bullet because our population is going to grow. Its energy needs and its demand for petroleum products is still going to grow. So what's going to happen is you're going to have, demand will be going this way. Dangote comes on stream. They can build a refinery in Angola. Then you have a kind of flattening for a little bit, but then it's going to take off again. So we're still going to have imports. So I think what we should be focusing on is one, let's ensure that we put in place a framework where we have we call it the Afri Clean Fuels Roadmap. Let's have harmonized specs across Africa. 10 ppm wherever it is. You cut down adulteration, you cut down smuggling, all those kinds of things, right? Then let's upgrade the refineries on the continent to produce 10 ppm. Already, if you're going from 3,000, 4,000 ppm to 10 ppm, you're already reducing pollution, right? You're already helping with this energy transition. 3, let's focus on, like you said, the FCC or the fuel catalytic cracker is how you get gasoline. It's called a cracking unit because they have what they call a crack spread in from every barrel of crude, as you go through the different refining units, the highest value is gasoline. So if you're not producing gasoline, which a lot of the smaller refineries, some of the modular ones and like don't do, you are not really maximizing the value from the crack spread, right? And what happens in those situations is you are now producing things that are not as clean, like fuel oil and the like. When you hear refineries producing fuel oil, that's not a good thing. It's not. In fact, the refinery of the future should have petrochemicals beside it, and like Dangote, I think they're almost very minute, if any, fuel oil, because you don't design refineries like that anymore. So the focus for refining really should be, let's produce cleaner fuels, 1. 2, let us ensure that we eliminate our flares so that we're at net zero and we can actually generate carbon credits that we can actually use to fund this energy transition. Because you're going to have to pay for it, right? Yeah. 3, let's look at our energy efficiency indexes. Are we as efficient as we can be? Do we have the right kind of technology in place to do that? And let's get our utilization up. Let's, as much as possible, invest in technology that allows us to produce cleaner fuels, gasoline, and particularly, because that way the bottoms of the dirty fuel oil and like you're not producing.
Wait, so you were saying about 10 parts per million sulfur. Is that is that for petrol?
Petrol as well as diesel, gas oil, yes. It's called, I don't like to say this, it's called Euro 5, but we call it Afri 6. So we're in Cape Town, so it's Afri 6, it's not Euro 5.
What is, I mean, if I go and fill up my car, how much sulfur is in that petrol?
Oh, I couldn't tell you an exact amount. Well, it depends. How big is your car?
Oh, it's tiny. It's a Renault Sandero. I barely fit.
No, but jokes aside, I think the idea should be everybody, in the US, in Europe, it's 10 ppm sulfur.
Really?
Since everybody is using 10 ppm sulfur, when you burn that, the amount of pollution is less. So you cannot, there's some places where you go. So in Nigeria, you've heard, I'm sure, about the suit in Port Harcourt and all of that, because there are a lot of illegal refineries. And when you have illegal refineries that are not complying with world-class standards, you start to generate soot, black, and you have pollution and respiratory issues and the rest. So I think our goal is, let's standardize 10 ppm. Let's try and ensure we have bankable projects.
So when I go to the petrol station, they have the different grades of fuel. Is that about the amount of?
No, that's different.
Is it even worth paying more for that fuel? I'm just wondering for myself.
Do you have a Ferrari? If you did, I'd say yes.
No, I do not have a Ferrari. Maybe one day, but no. You had mentioned though about paying for it, about the African states, governments, companies have to pay for it. I mean, how are we going to actually finance updating these refineries, stopping flaring?
Well, like I mentioned, ARDA has a sustainable finance group, and what we've been working on is a resource mobilization plan. It's similar to what I did while I was at NNPC. I spent a bit of time trying to put in place funding to upgrade NNPC refineries. And the sources of funding are simple. One, so the big thing is in the past, you could get money from commercial banks, but you can't anymore because they're being beaten up by the folks who went to COP26 to tell them that they shouldn't invest in oil and gas or fossil fuel. In fact, no. I've been working on a project with Standard Bank and the Global LPG Partnership on trying to put in place an African LPG sector development fund. When they were going to take this to the board, everybody got scared because of the activists at Standard Bank's last AGM. I'm sure you saw it on the news. Yeah. So banks can do, but you have development finance institutions. So you have people like Afrixim, who's very bullish because they support fossil fuels. There's another big institution, I'm not going to say the name here, but they don't even fund gas projects, not even oil. African. You have export credit agencies. So if you're going to buy any equipment from any country, for example, you're going to buy technology from Honeywell or Accent, UOP or Accent for your refinery, they have an export credit agency that can give you the money to do that. You have traders who want to buy the products. They can give you that funding. So it's putting together a consortium of these types of folks and going forward and being able to deploy that money on bankable projects. So I'll give you an example. The SIR refinery in Cote d'Ivoire about 2 years ago now, worked with the African Finance Corporation and put in a 577 million euro facility successfully. SAR and I believe in it, SAR in Senegal is doing something similar now. So I was just in Gabon, I'm talking to the guys at Sogara about a hydrocracker project that they want to do. But the pools of funding, as I said, the guys who have the technology, they should bring money because they're not doing new refineries in Europe, so where are they going to put their technology? They better bring money. The traders can bring money. The development finance institutions can bring money. But the projects have to be bankable, and that's kind of what we're trying to share with our members now in terms of, I joke with them that you're not refiners, you're a businessman in the business of refining, and as a result, you have to be looking at making sure you have bankable projects going forward. But I think it's doable.
And Philippe, have you found, you're based in Europe at the moment, have you seen that push where it's harder to get money based off of no, we're not going to do oil and gas, we're not going to touch that, we need to do stuff that's more renewable?
Well, it was difficult before COP26. I don't know how difficult it's going to be now. I have to say that I have seen, and we know groups of people, including people in the Middle East and Canada, who still invest privately in oil and gas exploration because they like the sector, because they understand it, perhaps because they don't understand cryptos and cannabis enough.
In Canada, they understand cannabis.
Not necessarily the old generations. And there's money for mining as well. So it's more and more difficult, but I think there are solutions. One solution I would hope for is one that I know was discussed yesterday in Paris by President Buhari, which is to have a sort of a sovereign African fund, which could be funded by the countries that are actually producing. And the other half is the countries that are going to get into real trouble because everything's extremely expensive and they have no energy at all. Half the countries in Africa have no oil and no coal, and have a huge challenge ahead that they haven't realized yet. But maybe one way to finance it is to pull forces together, and also with the unitization, whatever it's the right word, of the products that are circulated. It's not just, there will be intra-country trade, which today is very difficult, unless you're a smuggler. It's quite difficult to bring, Nigerian gasoline into Benin, for instance.
But it's a good point that there is a lot of inter-African trade. It's just not regulated. It's smuggled in.
Well, some of it is regulated, some of it isn't. Yeah.
But what do you think there is the political will. So, anybody, you mentioned about the African Free Trade Agreement, and there's always been a lot of rhetoric about let's come together. I mean, Buhari's let's make an African sovereign wealth fund, but it does then bring in the questions like who's going to manage it, where's the money going to go, and I mean thus far, if you look at the history of kind of regional integration attempts on the continent, they haven't ended all that well. There's been a lot of rhetoric more than implementation.
Which isn't so different from Europe or...
No, well, Europe's done a little bit more of a success story than what we've seen here.
Yes.
Very different
But
situations.
lots of rhetoric,
and
absolutely.
But do you think there is the political will to kind of put this forward, or do you think there will still be the kind of at times maybe selfish sovereignty, I will look after my country first before actually doing something that will help others, other poorer countries? Do you think it's, I mean, this is a bit of a controversial question perhaps, but do you think there is the political will to put this forward?
Well, I think time will tell, but certainly the mindset is changing quickly at the high level with a few of the presidents of African countries. They're willing to do what it takes, and I think the talent is there to make it happen.
Yeah.
So.
Just adding to that, you're right, this is a difficult question, but I think never before has there been such an existential threat to the major source of livelihood of many African countries. That's the reality. So the level of focus of African leaders on COP26 and getting ready for it. My sister from OPEC is here. Under their leadership, OPEC set up the OPEC Africa Energy Dialogue. That is OPEC driven, but we coordinate with AFREC, which is the African Energy Commission under the African Union. APO, the African Petroleum Producers Organization, which covers the upstream, and ARDA, which covers the downstream. And the goal was, in preparation for COP26, we needed to have harmonized positions on what we're going to. And the sheer level of work that was done, and this is just on the OPEC side, and each country, because, I mean, this is a threat to your way of life.
Yeah.
Majority of the foreign exchange and everything. So, and I think what is also happening is, I always say this, there's a big push on, everybody knows, I'm sure, SDG number 7, right? Clean and affordable energy for all. But people need to know that there's an SDG number 9 very close by, which is infrastructure, industrialization, and innovation. How is Africa going to get that if we don't do any investments in oil and gas or natural resources? So there's a balance. And I'm not saying that Africa is not going to follow energy transition. I think when you look at the title, the very long title of this session, it talks about a just transition. And a just transition means it's not one size fits all. Africa has a very different trajectory, and as a result, we should, stakeholders should respect our trajectory and then give us the support. Don't say you're not funding oil and gas projects in Africa. How do we get out of energy poverty? When you talk of, they talk of universal access to electricity. For goodness sake, there's an article we're talking about before that says, California uses more energy on video games than the whole country of Kenya. That is the truth. That is the fact. So you cannot be talking about the same approach you would have for North America, Europe, and Africa. So we're saying, let us develop at our own pace. Let us go and take the time to get the technology to a mature, cost-effective stage. Everybody remembers when there were landlines. And everybody wanted to put landlines everywhere. But who uses that today? It's the same analogy. Why should we be investing in generation 1, generation 2, solar, carbon capture, and all of that? No, let them do it. We're only 2.73%. They're at 30. When they get it right and they figured it out, then bring it here. But in the meantime, can we get cleaner transport and cooking fuels so that we don't have a public health disaster? That's just. That's what we mean by just transition. And more importantly, can we ensure that the development finance institutions that are willing to support this African just energy transition are not penalized for it, and other financial institutions?
Do you think there's also an argument to be made, like you said, that landlines is a very good point? And I mean, I think, if anyone's now saying we should put landlines down, complete waste of money. It's not necessary. So it could be, I think a lot of African countries have been able to kind of leap forward. Do you think there could also be the same push with energy, with rather than going through what the West did, rather than going through this, why not look ideally indigenous African solutions to finding, improving solar, improving hydrogen, improving wind, and almost maybe leapfrogging through the stages that Europe and the West went through?
When they talk of leapfrogging, I want it to be clear. If we wanted to leapfrog, let's do it in all aspects. We should not just be consumers. Let us produce. Let us manufacture here. Bring the plants here. The lithium is in the DRC. Bring the plants here. The cobalt is there. Bring the plants here. Invest here. Let us set up the research technology centers here. Put our people to work. Don't just sell us batteries. No, we don't want to just buy. Yeah. Put everything here. This is where majority of the rare earth metals that are going to drive energy transition are in Africa, right? So bring the work here. Bring the jobs here. That's just.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I have a couple more questions, but if anyone wants to jump in with a question, again, by all means, go for it.
I would just add to what you said that energy transition for the rest of the world is relying very heavily on mining in Africa, which uses a lot of imported oil. You take an example, you operate a mine in the Congo or in Zambia. I think somebody told me that the diesel number of trucks that go up every day is between 500 and 1,000, all the way from Mozambique. Otherwise, you wouldn't be producing any copper to send to Tesla, to send to China to make batteries for Tesla. So it's all twinned and integrated, and it's important that the image is changed, the mindset of people is changed, and that the reality is known. There's not going to be transition outside in America, in China, unless they keep operating. And so we have to change the way people are operating in Africa in all sectors, producing more industry and doing cleaner mining. Also, importantly enough, the central part of Africa is one of the big reservoirs of trees, which have been exceedingly smuggled in different ways over the last few years. And it's nice to see, programs from Total, from some of the other people in Congo, in Cameroon, in Gabon, that will create, compensatory carbon credits. It's important to preserve what we have and not, as you said before, a lot of it is used to cook. You cut trees and you cook because you haven't got LPG, because you haven't got other means to heat your food. So everything is linked, and that's the point I wanted to make. So questions, everybody, anyone?
Good, because I have more.
You have
They're not
one.
going to take it. I told you.
Please rescue us from these questions.
Yeah, I'm going to get you in crap with all
Is
the
there a
governments.
mic going in the room?
That's fine. I've got a question. I'm good. I've got you. You mentioned about ESG in your presentation. This is something that at Control Risk we're doing a lot more on. We always kind of dealt with the G part of it, but the environmental and the social part, especially looking at human rights and labor laws. Philippe, with you, like in Europe, for investment and stuff, have you found that ESG has become a much bigger thing? And with companies down here, I know there was a Ernst & Young interview with mining CEOs, and this year ESG was the #1 risk factor for them, when 10 years ago it probably wouldn't have even accounted, and might have been number 10. Has there been a big push that you've seen for investment that if you're going to invest on the continent or anywhere, that there really needs to be ESG as part of your investment plan?
Definitely, yeah, absolutely. Now, a lot of it is communication, and there should be more action than communication, but people communicate a lot about ESG. I couldn't open my phone a few months ago without having publicity from Glencore saying how nicely they were operating ESG in the DRC or in Zambia. I didn't have much interest in looking at the time, but this is something that all the mining companies are very conscious about, all the oil companies, and looking for ways to compensate. Yeah, absolutely, very important.
Thank you, Philippe. So it's front and center right now. That's why I mentioned when I showed you the list of virtual workshops we did, we had one called HSE as a license to operate. So a couple of years ago, they used to have in the finance world what they called equator principles. And this is it was kind of the precursor to ESG, where you had to demonstrate that if any financier is putting money into a venture, you had to ensure that it was not going to degrade the community and all of that. That has all been ramped up. This is now environmental, social, and governance. Shareholders are beating up financiers if they are not actually demonstrating how they are complying with ESG factors in their business. So we believe in ARDA again, sometimes HSE and quality are spoken about, but you need to fund them. And that's why we put out this thing about license to operate, because that is the bedrock of ESG. And you're not going to get any funding to upgrade your refinery to do anything if you don't have HSE policies, ESG policies, and the like. So it's a mindset thing, but you cannot get any money now without ESG. Just re-emphasizing what Philippe said. You can't. It's just not possible. No credit committee is going to pass it.
Right, and my final question is to wrap up, and then we'll see if there's any others, but if not, we'll wrap it up. Final words, I mean, it would be great actually, are there examples of success stories within the continent where we have been able to reduce greenhouse gases and find a solution towards this?
Well, I think it's evolving, right? First of all, what may happen is some people may not actually be publicizing some of the things they've done as well as they should. For example, in Côte d'Ivoire, Sarah Refinery has actually done stuff on energy efficiency. They've actually done stuff to reduce their flare, but it's not been as publicized. In the news, Gabon recently sold carbon credits to Norway, and that was a big deal. That's the first big thing. And I think as we go forward and it becomes more and more mainstream, like I mentioned, we're going to be signing an MOU with, once you release me from here, I'll go sign it, with Vitol on how do we come up with a program for identifying they're called carbon abatement projects across refineries, flare elimination, energy efficiency, and all of that kind of stuff. And how do we start to come up with ultimately what I hope will be a carbon credits trading platform for Africa that ensures that when it's done right, but not just done right, that we actually get to benefit from the credits ourselves. So anybody who does this. So I think it's starting to happen, and I believe after COP26, there's going to be a lot more focus on it, a lot more emphasis. The traders, quite a few of them, Trafigura, Vitol, and the like, have set up carbon credits trading desks. So they're actively looking for opportunities to do this because they have to balance their operations in Europe and elsewhere that need carbon credits to survive.
Right. Philippe, the final word. Any success stories from your experience and with the African Energy Chamber as well?
Well, I think there are a few success stories, but I think there are some very strong announcements and a few deals and situations to follow that will prove themselves to be very good in 2 or 3 or 4 years. I think it's a little early to talk about big successes because a lot of it is dust in your eyes. But I'm hopeful. I would also add that it might creating a carbon credit market for Africa might also create a pricing for it, separate from the world pricing. We've seen what's happening with the gas prices over the world. It's gone completely crazy for the last month. I think it's important that maybe some new directions will include Africa pricing its own commodity baskets for themselves, as opposed to being a consequence of the prices in New York or in the Far East or in Rotterdam.
Absolutely.
That would be my final word. Lots of hope.
And on
And
that,
hard work.
Yeah. And on that, thank you guys very much. Can we have a round of applause for our speakers? Thank you very much, guys.